Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, and I'm the president of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is devoted to the very sensitive issue of international sanctions. This seminar is organized by the Istituto Affari Internazionali with the support and in collaboration with Banca Intesa, in the context of a partnership that we have established with Banca Intesa, and it will practice on the current practice in international sanctions, with a focus on the evolution, trends that we are witnessing in sanctions, on their effectiveness, their impact, humanitarian impact in particular, but also and probably mainly on the implications of sanctions for the private sectors. And we will see some categories of sanctions in particular. As you all know, sanctions has become a very highly utilized instrument of foreign policy. In the past, sanctions were more global and general. In the most recent years, they tended to become more targeted, more focused. The idea is to reduce the impact of sanctions on population of targeted countries. But as I said, targeted sanctions have their problems, their implications, which we will discuss this afternoon. In particular, they tend to affect the financial and banking sectors through bans on financial and banking operations, and also with limitations on investments. Broadly speaking, two phenomena are characterizing the situation at present. First, I would say that both international organizations, but also states or group of states, have expanded the number of motivations for which they utilize sanctions. So we have sanctions that are a response to terrorist activities, that are a response to frequent or systematic violations of human rights. There are sanctions that are meant to punish violations of territorial integrity. There are sanctions that are also adopted to contrast or limit the scope of organized international crime organization. A second phenomenon which we are witnessing in these days is the more frequent use of unilateral and also of extraterritorial sanctions. The unilateral approach, which means sanctions that are adopted outside a framework of legitimation by international organizations, like, for instance, the UN, are utilized more and more frequently. They have become a very frequently utilized instrument of foreign policy, in particular by some countries. And the second phenomenon that we are also witnessing is a very frequent and certainly an increased recourse to secondary sanctions, targeted but also secondary sanctions. This practice has been particularly adopted by the US, so this to be very clear. And through, I would say, through main instruments. First, by stretching to the maximum possible the territorial links between the sanctioned entity or person and the sanctioning state, but second, also by adopting sanctions that are meant to hit persons that are not nationals of the sanctioning state, but that are pursuing or have pursued relations with the sanctioned states. To be very frank and honest, this problem of secondary sanctions have become an issue, in particular in relations between the European Union and the US administration. It's not a mystery. It's been on the agenda of several meetings, including at highest possible level, and it continues to remain an unresolved problem. A problem that affects in particular the private sector of European companies, the risk being sanctioned by the US for entertaining relations with countries that have been sanctioned by the US. So I would stop here because I'm not a specialist. I've spoken even too much. I only wish to thank one more Banca Intesa for their support to this event and more generally to the Istituto. And also a special thank to all the discussants, the panelists. I will not list all of them, but I am very grateful for their participation, for the fact that they have accepted. I see some of them are in presence, most are in remote, but thank again very much. And I wish a very fruitful and useful discussion on a very, very sensitive issue. And now I leave the floor to Paolo Quercia, who has accepted to share and moderate the webinar. Paolo, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. My name is Paolo Quercia. I am a longtime friend of IAI. I've been cooperating with the Institute for many years. And I think that IAI chose a very, very right moment to raise this discussion with the very relevant speakers. Why is the right moment? Because, first of all, we have several things we can mention. Let me mention very few. For example, we see the European Union more and more often dealing with sanctions. We just remember a few days ago the issue of Belarus, how it was handled also through sanctions. So sanctions make their important, they play a core role in the European Union external actions. But we also know that in a few days in Vienna, they will start again the talks, mediated again by the European Union between the US and Iran. So we are again in the field of sanctions. Very important one, the nuclear talks about the future of JCPOA. And as Ambassador Nelly Feroci mentioned, this is a clear case of secondary sanctions, since Europe decided to remain in JCPOA and US stepped out, creating a huge gap for companies. But also, for example, we saw some days ago, probably a couple of weeks ago, how OFAC just finished his review of the sanctions. So the US Treasury, the change of administration brought a review of US sanctions. And now we are very curious to see how Biden will differently use this instrument compared to the present president. So sanctions, and then now I finish my introduction to leave the core to our experts, is a big part of international relations today. It's not only about sanctions, because sanctions have some friends. I call them sanctions and company, because there are other tools of economic statecraft that are more and more often used by state in the present international environment. So what is the key word is the economic coercion. How you can coerce somebody using economy, how you can protect yourself from the abuse of economic coercion from somebody else. We also know European Union is discussing an anti-coercion instrument, better than the one that are already in place, for example. So I think that I wanted to put some elements on the table. And the secondary sanctions, of course, are a crucial part of it. The mentioned gap between the US is not only about Iran. We can see also about Venezuela in some case, about Cuba as well. But we also have to remember the Brexit and the UK building its own sanction schemes and enforcement. And maybe one day we can have even more differences inside the the Western world. So this is everything for me now, just as some extra words to kickstart our debate. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Thomas Bierstecker, honorary professor in international relations and director of policy research in the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And I think he will introduce us to a core issue, that is the issue of financial sanctions. That is a crucial point, how it has been developed, especially in the UN context. Professor, yours is the floor for around 7-10 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to join the discussion. And I'm sorry I cannot be there in person, but I appreciate you making adjustments to allow me to participate virtually. The issue of extraterritorial sanctions is, as already mentioned, especially salient today as we are on the verge of a return to the negotiations in Vienna on the potential US return to the JCPOA next Monday. Perhaps something we can take up and discuss in more detail during the question and answer period at the end of these brief interventions. As already noted, I work primarily on United Nations sanctions, but UN sanctions do not exist in a vacuum. Rather, they interact with a variety of other policy instruments, including other sanctions regimes, such as those applied by the US and the European Union. I was initially asked to concentrate on financial sanctions, with which I've been working for more than 20 years now. And let me just put them in historical context, because the move to the introduction and development of targeted financial sanctions was triggered by the unacceptably high humanitarian costs of the comprehensive sanctions regime imposed on Iraq during the 1990s. And I had the opportunity to participate in the Interlaken meetings in Switzerland in the late 1990s and co-authored the Interlaken manual for the design of targeted financial sanctions for the Swiss government a couple of years later in 2001. And it's important to recall that when it was first suggested that targeted financial sanctions be applied to individuals or to governments in the form of asset freezes, the blocking of financial transactions, or restrictions on the financial sector more generally, when that idea was first being floated, there was very little reflection on how targeted financial sanctions would affect the private financial institutions that would invariably be called upon to implement the measures. There was also little consensus on what it meant to target a government or a regime with financial sanctions. Indeed, 20 years ago, most financial institutions did not use or even have access to name recognition software to detect potential risks. And the size of most compliance units was small in comparison to the amount of time and attention being devoted to compliance across the financial sector today. Now, today, all UN, all EU, and most US sanctions are targeted in some way. Comprehensive sanctions regimes made a comeback during the Trump administration with its so-called maximum pressure strategy against Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and North Korea. But the Biden administration has been quietly relaxing some of them, although not necessarily doing it strategically in diplomacy yet. But most sanctions regimes are targeted in some form, and this invariably increases the complexity of implementing them. Now, financial sanctions are particularly attractive to policy practitioners for a couple of reasons. 3 or 4 actually. First, because they can be targeted on the perpetrators of norm violations directly. Second, they're less blunt than broad sectoral trade restrictions. Third, they can have an immediate effect. And fourth, in some instances, they've proven to be highly effective in provoking a response from the targets. Probably one of the most celebrated cases, although sometimes for the wrong reasons, is the Banco Delta Asia case. Ultimately, it proved to be counterproductive, but nonetheless, it certainly got the attention of the North Korean government at the time. It demonstrated that targeted financial sanctions could be a very potent policy instrument. And I think that's one of the reasons we see the turn to them in so many different issue domains, as was pointed out at the very beginning of this webinar. Now, let me elaborate for a moment on the different types of targeted financial sanctions, because we oftentimes just focus on asset freezes and think that's the universe, but not all financial sanctions are the same. Indeed, we have, through our research on targeted financial sanctions used by the UN, which is now reproduced in the app that we've developed, UN Sanctions app, we've identified at least 11 types of financial sanctions from our research, plus additional recommended measures for the financial sector. Let me just list them and group them in a couple of categories. With regard to mandatory restrictions on individuals or entities, there are two different types of targeted financial sanctions. One, the most commonly used, is an asset freeze or blocking of transfers, and roughly 50% of all UN sanctions regimes employ these measures. Occasionally, there's a technical freeze and transfer of assets to new authorities, a variation on that. This was applied in the case of Iraq after 2003. But those are the individual or entity that, I mean, I'm thinking of company, corporate entity, or political parties, or non-state armed groups, mandatory restrictions in the financial sector. But we now see 5 other types of mandatory restrictions on the financial sector in general. One, in the case of Eritrea, there was a prohibition on diaspora taxation. Secondly, in the case of Libya, there was a block on financial transactions related to crude oil. We've seen more dramatic, widespread restrictions, financial sector restrictions on North Korea, prohibitions on the opening of new accounts or bank branches in the country. Another type, prohibitions on financial support for trade transactions, both applied to DPRK, and freezing of funds and financial resources of an entire government or governing authority. And that's been applied both in Haiti and in Libya after 2011. So we have at least 7 different types of mandatory restrictions on individuals, on entities, or on the financial sector in general. And with specific reference to the DPRK or North Korea, there are some creative thinking at the UN which have created what we call conditional restrictions. And these are restrictions that require entities to act to restrict transactions if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the financial services could contribute to the DPRK's nuclear or ballistic missile programs. So one of these is closing accounts if credible information exists that they could contribute to the nuclear program. The second is blocking transfers if credible information, again, provides reasonable grounds to think that it could be used for the proscribed activities. A third type is blocking of export credits, guarantees, and insurance, again, where such financial support could contribute to the programs. And the fourth is freezing of all government funds under domestic jurisdiction if the state determines they're associated with the DPRK's nuclear domestic. So these are all not mandatory blanket restrictions, but if a government, UN member state, believes that they could be used in this way, they are required to block those transactions. And beyond that, there are even recommended restrictions, sometimes with regard to implementing specific financial action task force recommendations, introducing due diligence procedures for insurance companies, exercising vigilance with regard to businesses under the control of the government, or halting new financial commitments to investment or trade. So I just want to emphasize we have mandatory restrictions, conditional restrictions, recommended restrictions. And this, by the way, is just the set of restrictions that exist in the financial sector itself. So just to, not only is there a great variety of forms and types of financial sanctions coming from just the UN, but there's also great complexity when it comes to interpreting what it means for private sector entities responsible for implementing it. Thus, and this takes me a bit in a segue to the main theme of today's webinar, it's not surprising that so many financial institutions resort to de-risking strategies to minimize their exposure. And at times, this means they transform highly targeted financial sanctions regimes into de facto financial sector embargoes, with implications trade, and I'm sure, as Erica will elaborate, for humanitarian activities and support as well. Now, de-risking, I don't blame the financial sector. It's actually quite prudent for financial institutions with large holdings in the US or significant correspondent banking relationships with US financial institutions, which means their dollar transactions are cleared to US institutions and fall under US jurisdiction. Falling under US jurisdiction matters because the US really has the only real enforcement body for the implementation of sanctions. It's called the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC. And global financial institutions, quite frankly, in my view, are not worried about UN or EU enforcement for that matter, but they're worried about US enforcement actions because they can go into billions of dollars, as BNP discovered today. BNP Paribas discovered a few years ago. Now, the UN and EU also use secondary sanctions for egregious violations of their existing sanctions regimes, but they rely more heavily on secondary sanctions on the evaders, adding them to lists rather than the applications of large fines and penalties, which include not just financial penalties, but often sometimes market exclusion for periods of time, again, as the BNP Paribas settlement indicated. So let me just conclude with a couple of sanctions trends. And it has implications for the broader question about the application of extraterritorial unilateral measures. Right now, I would say we're facing gridlock at the UN Security Council. We haven't had any new sanctions regimes created since 2017. Before that, between 1990 and 2015, there was an average of one new UN sanctions regime created every year, but we've had nothing in the last 4 years. For the last 3 years, 2019 to 2021, the UN has delisted more individuals than it has listed, reversing a pattern that had lasted for more than 25 years. So as a result, I would argue, as long as this gridlock continues, I anticipate what we're going to see is a trend toward increased informal multilateral coordination of sanctions by relatively like-minded states operating outside the UN framework. That means the US, the EU, the UK, Canada, Australia, and sometimes also including Japan and South Korea. It's even possible that there will be less visible forms of cooperation from India. Now, since these informal multilateral sanctions are not universal in scope like UN sanctions are, since they're legally binding on all member states, this means that the challenge of extraterritoriality is not likely to go away for the foreseeable future. Indeed, it could intensify because the only way to ensure that your unilateral sanctions have a maximum impact is to apply them extraterritorially. So on this note, it's interesting, and this is my last point, it's interesting to watch the learning curve of China when it comes to sanctions. Although China remains officially opposed to the use of sanctions, China has declared its intent to make its blocking statute on Hong Kong sanctions extraterritorial in reach. So now we have conflicting extraterritorial claims from both the US and China. So if we thought the way was difficult in the past, I would suggest it's going to get even more difficult for private sector institutions in the future. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Really, thanks. Thank you a lot, especially for this, the last words last concept that you reminded us, especially this nexus between unilateralism and extraterritoriality. I think something we have to think over is very, very important. But now we go further with our panelists, and the next speaker is Francesco Giumelli, Associate Professor in International Relations, University of Groningen. And we will move a bit further to also to the issue of the implementation of sanctions, and especially if and how do they work? What is their effectiveness today?
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you, Tom, and also the others. Thanks to Yai for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about these topics. The question that you were asking me about the effectiveness is normally possibly the most common or frequently asked questions when it comes to sanctions. Do sanctions work? And of course, these questions stand whether we talk about financial sanctions, any kind of sanctions, whether we talk about targeted or comprehensive sanctions. This is possibly the common theme across the literature. The interesting element to me and to many of my colleagues is that it was always very difficult to understand, pinpoint, to grasp what does it mean? What do we mean when we ask whether sanctions work? Are we talking about the achievement of a specific objective? Are we talking about the achievement of a specific policy goal, of a strategy? So sanctions are always part of a bigger strategy. They're never imposed by themselves. There is this misguided understanding that sanctions by themselves can change the behavior of or dramatically change any course of action. So for a policy crisis where sanctions are imposed. And this is always, of course, this is something that you can always hope when you use sanctions as much as you use anything else. The point is that sanctions are always used in combination with other foreign policy tools, and by themselves, it's difficult to determine any dramatic policy change. What we normally talk about in the sanctions literature, we try to think about what kind of contribution do we expect sanctions to provide to a broader strategy or a broader policy objective. So we think indeed about, okay, does sanctions change the policy or the behavior of a target? But sanctions can also be imposed to limit and constrain what a target or an actor can or cannot do. Sometimes sanctions are imposed because you don't want to punish someone for what happened already in the past, but you want to make sure that something that you don't want to happen will not happen in the future. And the only way to do this maybe is to limit the capabilities of certain actors to carry out certain actions. But then there is another important element that sanctions can achieve and do achieve very often, which is sending signals. Signals are of different form. We can think about signaling the direct targets. We can think about signaling an audience. The audience can also be an internal audience. It doesn't have to be necessarily an outside audience. It can be about stigmatizing certain behaviors, something that is fundamentally wrong. And whether you think that the imposition of sanctions will prevent that event from happening ever again, you don't know that, but it's still important to send a signal saying that behavior is wrong. And this is against international norms, and therefore we will sanction it no matter what happens. So this is the kind of spectrum that we think about when we think about the effectiveness of sanctions. There are other elements. Are sanctions useful, or are sanctions convenient? This is also another important question that we often don't ask. How much do we pay to have sanctions imposed versus the policy objective that we achieve? Sometimes something is very expensive and you achieve very little. Sometimes you can achieve exactly the same thing by spending less. In that case, sanctions become very comparatively with other foreign policy tools, very convenient. So this is more or less just to give you a little bit of a premise of what we mean when we think about effectiveness. Very often there is a confusion between effectiveness and impact. And this is what leads me also, because impact is directly determined by the implementation of sanctions. And indeed, targeted sanctions, financial targeted sanctions, have huge implementation challenges when it comes to who does what and how states translate a policy idea, which is a sanction, into laws and into practice. Sometimes you have very, and again, I want to stress this point. The impact has very little to do with the effectiveness. Very often you have disaster, very impactful sanctions. That's what. Okay, no problem. I continue. That's what Professor Vistega was saying before when it comes to the evolution of sanctions from comprehensive to targeted. The idea was if the impact is too strong, then you cannot have successful sanctions. So the idea is that impact is not linked to success. And that's why we need to start thinking about impact as rather, is there an impact to who suffers from the imposition of sanctions? And this question is linked to the implementation of sanctions. What do states do to put this into practice? There are three big challenges. Some of them have been already quickly mentioned by Tom. I will just mention them because the point I want to achieve is another one. First, these are extremely complicated measures to implement. It's about going after information that we don't have, to prevent events that we don't know. And that's why it's very difficult to write even down laws that would give guidelines to either states, state actors, agencies, but also the private sector, companies, banks, or whoever. This is about assessing risk. And this is normally done by states. Very often they make mistakes because assessing risks is very complicated. And the issue about targeted sanctions is that states cannot implement by themselves these measures. It must be a cooperation, a joint venture between state actors and the private sector. And this is something that we cannot escape, we cannot avoid. And therefore also we're asking not only states to make assessments about things that they don't know, but we are delegating these requests, this authority to the private sector, and we are asking them to do things that they are designed not to be able to do. And this, of course, increases the complexity of the situation. And that's why we have very often problems. The first one is overlapping regimes, because indeed companies don't know. Sometimes you are based in Italy and you need to follow US legislation. Sometimes you're based in India and then now you get a phone call or you read on the newspaper that the Chinese authorities might be implementing this. Sometimes you need to follow, you're dealing with the EU base, sometimes you follow, you deal with the US base, and everything changes all the time. So there is this complication for the private sector. And then of course there is the big elephant in the room, which is the extraterritoriality of US sanctions. The idea that no matter where you are, and we're talking now especially about secondary sanctions, you need to follow the US legislation. This creates a big problem because of course, who is supposed to be doing the monitoring? And who is supposed to be doing the checking if everybody on Earth is following, or feels like that needs to follow the US legislation? What is the role of the other actors? I mean, Professor Bistaker was telling us about this informal cooperation among different actors. What is determining the behavior of the private sector if at the end of the day, this informal cooperation ends up in Washington or in New York, because in the court it is in New York, and the companies have only that option ahead of them. So there is this big problem when it comes to implementation of who is doing what that needs to be addressed and dealt with. But then, of course, there is the other side of the coin, which is my last point for my first round is if there is an implementation and if there is overcompliance, are we sure that everybody is complying? Because this is a classical problem. Targeted sanctions are basically domestic issues, domestic instruments applied to the international system. We go after anyone on Earth. Now, a couple of administrations are also implementing and using sanctions for drug trafficking, human trafficking, things that normally you would never think about going after with foreign policy tools against. Even the UN has imposed sanctions on criminal networks in Libya for human trafficking. This is, again, not normally dealt by foreign policy makers. And if in domestic regulations, think about tax regulations, but even more simply, speed limit, there is evasion of speed limit in a place where potentially you can monitor everything and you can comply with everything because you're going on, and potentially you can check any car and then you can stop all of them, just put the police in the highways, and then you'll be able to do everything. Even in that case that you can do it, you don't do it, and there is evasion. So evasion is one of the important, another elephant. If we can have space for two elephants in the room, there is something that with the second elephant, very few people are thinking about. There is this overly care about the compliance and the overcompliance, but we very rarely think that, well, first, when we think about evasion, we think about evasion of companies, because we always think about the companies when bad things happen. But in the world of sanctions, we see, which is a world purely political, it is also states who have an interest in evading sanctions. And there are certain companies who are supported by states, or vice versa. So it's a game that goes beyond just someone driving faster than the speed limit allows. So we have this problem when it comes to the evasion. Then there are two kinds of responses. There is the one that we normally talk about, overcompliance. And this is the world of compliance. We're talking about the companies who actually, because they are afraid of violating the sanctions, what they do, they are conservative and they implement the sanctions even beyond the mandate of the sanctions. We never think about the world of those who do not want to comply. And we don't study that world. And of course, if there are the overcompliant, there must be somewhere, some companies or some actors who do not want to comply. And that is, if we think, I've done some studies to compare more or less the size of international trade and the size and the possibilities of deceiving the sanctions regulation. And again, we can go into details in the Q&A, but of course, there is no way you can monitor all the international trade at the same time. And there is very little you can do that is enough, given the size and the magnitude of international trade, to undermine a sanctions regime of a small country or a small network or a small region sometimes of a country. So that's why evasion is very important. And then when it comes to evasion, we think about actors who are supposed to be doing the monitoring and the checking. And then, of course, we go back to Washington, and we go back to the very important activism of OFAC, of the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the US. And this is creating also a number of problems that we rarely discuss. So first, we stop looking at, or we stop considering those who do not overcomply. And of course, as I said, there is always non-compliance when there is hyper-regulation. And OFAC and the activism of OFAC is a form of hyper-regulation, because of course, companies everywhere have to follow what it is written in Washington. But then also what it is, what we are seeing now, and this is another set of responses that we should be talking about more constantly, because it is affecting the world of sanctions and the effectiveness of the whole system, is the responses. We've seen this everywhere. In the EU, we have already established a couple of activities to make sure that EU actors are not going to be suffering the consequences of OFAC. The blocking statute is an instrument to shield EU-based companies. We have Instex. We created an entire institute to make sure that OFAC cannot go after EU companies. But then we've seen other activities. We have seen a lot of attempts to use cryptocurrencies to create financial systems that are alternative to the financial systems that we know. Messaging systems being created by Russia and China, trying to avoid this system. So what we are seeing now is that there is one big agency in the international system that is imposing very big fines, or they're not even fines, a lot of pressures on companies who are forced to settle with US authorities, scaring those who want to comply, while we are doing very little with those who are trying to deceive the system, either by themselves or with the help of state authorities. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Francesco Giumelli for this very, very rich and interesting presentation. Issue of overcompliance is also a good point for us, for our debate, because it's also friendly for the companies, this concept. And you mentioned one important point, how sanctions are a very adaptable tool. They can be applied in many, many different ways. We know that financial sanctions were sort of created to fight the Taliban, the financial of terrorism, and finally they have been imposed on Russia after Crimea. So this is, they can go from a non-state to state actor with some changes. So it's a very, very tricky ground. But another aspect of difficulties of the sanction field is on the ethical point of view. It has been mentioned, the issue of humanitarian effects, the costs, because if sometimes sanctions don't reach the goal, or they don't reach the results attended, but for sure in many cases they bring problems to the population, to the civil sector, not only to government, oligarchs and companies. So I invite Erika Moret, a senior researcher in the Center for Global Governance in Geneva, to also introduce us to this concept of humanitarian effect of sanctions, especially making reference to some country that you have in mind. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paolo, and thank you very much to the Istituto Affari Internazionali for this very kind invitation to join you today. It's a real pleasure, and also great to see lots of familiar names among the participants, including some of our former students now working on sanctions in the private sector. And as ever, a big pleasure to be with my very long-standing colleagues, Thomas Bierstecker and Francesco Giumelli. So they're probably going to be very bored from what I'm about to say, because they've heard it all before, I'm sure. So you've already provided an extremely good platform for which I can talk about humanitarian impacts and unintended consequences more widely. As we've heard already, we're reaching something of a crisis in terms of global sanctions practice. And one of these areas that is very much on the minds of policymakers across the EU, at the UN and elsewhere, is that of the humanitarian impacts. Now, as we've seen already, sanctions represent the tool of choice, not only for the UN, but also for a range of regional organizations and governments across the world today. It's not just the US and the EU that are using sanctions. Of course, now the UK and Canada now have their own autonomous sanctions capacities. And we're also seeing a rise in use of sanctions, particularly in China, where the legislation has changed in the last year or two to enable the use of unilateral sanctions, and also something equivalent to the blocking statute as well. And then you might be surprised to learn that many other countries around the world as well, across the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, are also starting to use their own autonomous sanctions. So it's really an increasingly complex sphere. So why are we now thinking more about humanitarian impacts again? What any of you who have been following sanctions for many years will have seen that over the past few decades, targeted sanctions that were conceived very much through the work of Thomas Bierstecker and other colleagues and their inputs was supposed to have solved some of these problems that we saw in the likes of Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, Cuba, Haiti, and so on. What we've seen, of course, is a number of overlapping trends in the recent few years, particularly in the last decade, but especially in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. One has been the rise in very complex webs of overlapping sanctions regimes in certain countries. Think of the case of Syria, for example, where many different sanctioning powers have their sanctions in place. And not only that, but they're often combined with a range of other types of regulations as well. So export controls, counterterrorism regulations, measures in place to counter money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, corruption, and so on. So this is an incredibly complex, confusing compliance environment nowadays for the private sector and also for NGOs and so on. What we also have seen, as the other speakers have alluded to, is a broadening of sanctions regimes to cover increasingly sectoral measures. And many of these have been extraterritorial in nature when they've come from the United States. So those on financial sector and oil sectors and so on. Coming back to Thomas Bierstecker's point of the more aggressive US enforcement that we saw through the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump presidency, and that came hand in hand with a rise in extraterritorial or secondary sanctions on the part of the US. Another problem is that some of these hard-hitting sanctions regimes with an extraterritorial reach have been imposed in contexts where there are already humanitarian crises in place. Complex emergencies with vulnerable populations that may also entail refugee crises, environmental destruction, and so on. And so it's all the more controversial, I suppose, the imposition of these very crippling, hard-hitting sanctions that have a reach on a global level. Another factor is, of course, the dominance of the US dollar in international financial transactions. US dollar is subject to a range of different US regulations. And also the US's export controls that are implicit in some of the extraterritorial regimes mean that goods that have 10% or more US origin components can't be supplied or used or sold in certain jurisdictions. One final point I'd like to make is the wording in sanctions regimes can often make it very difficult for private sector and not-for-profit sector to operate in certain countries. If we take the example of Afghanistan today, for example, the US currently designates the Taliban as a terrorist entity, but it hasn't yet defined whether the entirety of the Afghan government, including all of its ministries, should be considered part of the Taliban. So it's kind of comes down to a legal question of ownership and control in some of these instances. And the US, the UK, the EU and others define ownership and control in different ways, which can really make it very problematic for certain humanitarian organizations, particularly if they have funding coming from different bodies from the US, the EU, and so on. So what do we have? We have a problem here that the others have already mentioned of overcompliance. And you may have heard it referred to as de-risking, particularly in the financial context. De-risking is where banks and financial institutions either curtail or withdraw their services from countries that are deemed to be high risk. We need to think here of the cases of, again, Syria, Afghanistan, also Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Yemen as well. The fines that have been levied by the US Treasury against some banks for being found in breach of certain sanctions has entered into the billions of US dollars. So you can really appreciate here why banks start to over-comply with some of the sanctions in place. It's simply not worth their while to risk these fines, also the reputational risks and the burdensome bureaucracy that comes hand in hand with just trying to stay compliant with some of these very complicated regimes that are in place. And we also see over-compliance across the private sector. It's not just banks. In some of the work that I'm doing at the moment at the Graduate Institute, trying to map out the challenges faced in the supply chains of essential goods to heavily sanctioned countries. In these cases, we're looking again at the ones I've mentioned, Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. We've seen that de-risking and over-compliance happens across the entire supply chain of essential goods. That's to say medicines, foods, vaccines, and so on. Logistics companies, insurance, the suppliers of software, hardware. It really does extend across the world because of the extraterritorial reach and across all different sectors and types of companies. And then it happens also to the charity sector, to the not-for-profit sector. You may have heard of it referred to here as the chilling effect. NGOs today, both international NGOs and local NGOs, face incredible challenges when they're trying to operate in these high-risk environments. If I could give the example of Syria, for example, I've just been working with one charity to try and help them understand whether they're able to provide support to the public education sector in the country. Even though there are exemptions in place, licensing exemptions, and for those of you who don't know what that is, all sanctions regimes have licenses in place that allow for certain types of activities, be it for humanitarian reasons, health, and so on. In some cases, they can be broad standing licenses. In the case of the US, this is called a general license. And in cases where there isn't enough clarity or not everything is allowed, then NGOs or companies can apply for a specific license. In the EU, this is called a derogation. Now, the problem is that only US organizations or recipients of US funding, as far as I understand it, can apply for a special license to the US for certain activities, whereas those in the EU or elsewhere can't. So immediately you have a problem with the reach of the licensing, humanitarian licenses and so on. Now, going back to the education question in Syria and what can humanitarian organizations actually do, there are all kinds of problems around, for example, not being able to pay teachers because they're considered civil servants linked to the Ministry of Education, not being able to provide laptops because they might be considered dual use goods, or not being able to provide fuel to schools in order to provide heating because of certain restrictions on the provision of fuel to government entities. So this is common in a lot of countries and it's a growing problem. The likes of the IMF, the World Bank, the G20 have all recognized this as a global crisis, de-risking the reduction in correspondent banking channels, for example. And the EU, along with its member states and a number of other countries around the world and organizations are trying to do what they can to mitigate some of the worst consequences of de-risking linked to this complex sanctions environment, compliance environment. Nevertheless, we haven't seen that much progress. There were some hopes that the US sanctions review under the Biden administration could provide some kind of relief. It's possible that some positive steps are on their way. In the case of Afghanistan, for example, there's been some positive reactions over the breadth of the general licenses that were created in September and the clarity of the guidance that has been given. But really, these are just piecemeal steps. There needs to be really quite dramatic revolutionary changes, in my view, in order for this not to render entire countries and vulnerable populations around the world unbanked or completely disconnected from the international financial system, which in turn will bring about all kinds of economic and humanitarian problems. In some of my work and that of my colleagues, including Tom and Francesco and others, we're doing a lot of thinking about what this can look like. And this has to begin at the policy end of the scale, particularly in the US, but also in the EU, UN and elsewhere, working its way through better capacity building, guidance, training, and so on, including the role that the blocking statute could play, but then coming down to what you might term the last mile end of the scale. So how to get money into these countries, how to enable humanitarian action to continue in spite of all the challenges. And this comes down to tech solutions, remittance options that are based on new innovations and so on, the role of digital currencies. And I see a question on cryptocurrencies in the Q&A box. And I think this is a really interesting thing we should talk about, because not only does it pose a risk to sanctions compliance, it can also provide an opportunity to humanitarian actors to keep carrying out their work, the use of digital assets and so on. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much once again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Erika Moret. Also because you enlarged a bit the angle of our discussion, that sanctions are not only an issue between state and private companies, you included also the humanitarian dimension, and also the issue of humanitarian assistance, the charities. And sanctions basically affect everybody who deals with some specific countries. Also universities can be or should have a sort of compliance when dealing with students moving around the world or funding research projects. So it's a very, very broad issue. And having said that, now we are very interested to give the floor to Anais Maria Rossi, because since she works in a multinational company, an Italian multinational company, where she is head of economic sanctions compliance, she can give the point of view from the point of view of her company of how does it mean, what does it mean for a big company to work in such a volatile environment made of very different restrictions and not coordinated, and sometimes with gaps and judicially conflictual ones. So please, also you have the 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you, Paolo, for introducing me, and thank you, Istituto Affari Internazionali, for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to meet you all, also, if only virtually. Today, as said by Paolo, I'll bring to you my experience as a representative of the private sector. And although we, as private actors, are mere spectators of the policy-making process, we are in the front line in the implementation of restrictions. We have a crucial role for their application. We could say, Professor Gemelli, correct me if I'm wrong, that the effectiveness or a restrictive measure also depends on the private sector reaction to such a measure. I have been dealing with sanctions for more or less 10 years. And in the last 10 years, the world has changed. As said before by Ambassador Nelly Feroci, sanctions nowadays are a privileged instrument for foreign policy with no signs of change. And sanction compliance more and more became a pivotal part of any compliance program for companies with a global exposure. And increasingly smart sanctions require also more and more effective compliance programs. And insurance compliance with sanctions, it's not an easy task. I'll try now to elaborate on 3-4 main challenges we face in dealing with sanctions. First of all, the origin of sanction risk. For a company with an international presence, sanction risk may be triggered by any aspect of a transaction. First of all, the interest countries or areas. And in this respect, we have to keep in mind that currently more than 30 countries are targeted by sanctions, with different degree of intensity. Second point, the type of activities you intend to perform. You all know there are certain activities and certain sector, above all finance, but also the energy sector, which are more frequently targeted by sanctions. But it is not only what you intend to do which matters. This leads to my third point, but also why you do it. So the aim of an activity may be relevant to understand if such activity may be prohibited or not. For example, and now I talk from my experience. Russian sanction program, the same item, I don't know, for example, on an energy item, a pipe, may be exported to Russia if it will be used for an onshore oil project, but the same item cannot be exported to Russia also to the same counterparty if it will be used for a deep water oil project. So not only the type of activities you intend to perform, but also your objective, the scope of the activity. And last point, and maybe the most relevant, is obviously your counterpart. As mentioned by Professor Bisteker before, the most common form of financial sanctions is the prohibition to make funds and resources available to certain sanctioned, certain designated person entities, assets that are frozen and which are designated in blacklist maintained by the competent authorities. One for all, the OFAC as the list. Apart from the thousands of individuals and entities which are included in such blacklists, sanction also prohibits to deal with entities that are not specifically designated, but that are owned or that are controlled by one or more persons which are in the blacklist. You may understand how this amplifies the spectrum of persons possibly subject to restriction. So this requires a very careful due diligence on possible counterparty for entering into any kind of business relationship, and require for a company also to equip itself with very sophisticated application to perform appropriate KYC, know your customer process on any possible business partner. So going back to my question, to why sanctions compliance, it's not an easy task. First, we have seen you can find sanction risk anywhere. Second challenge, the language used in the sanction regulation is often very broad and also very undefined, something typical of politics rather than legal text. Sanctions are written by politicians to reach foreign policy goals, but are full-fledged laws that often leave room for different interpretation. And again, I'll give you some example from my experience. Significant and material are two adjectives that you can often find in sanction regulation. Well, I said I have been dealing with sanctions since 2010. However, I really do not know how to reply to a colleague of mine in business, which asked me, when under a specific sanction programs, a transaction can be considered significant, or an assistance to a sanctioned party may be deemed material, because there is not a clear explanation from the authority of what this terms actually means. And this, from the authority's point of view, this uncertainty, this lack of clarity, optimize sanction enforcement, give them more flexibility in the enforcement and more discretionality in the application of sanction. But from a company point of view, this makes the business environment extremely complicated and unpredictable. Third point, why is a challenge ensuring sanction compliance? Because, as said before today by the speaker, I'm talking from a European company, but I have also to apply a sanction, or also to consider your sanctions. I could bore you for hours talking about the difference between primary and secondary sanctions, but the reality is that any sanction enacted by the US could have a certain degree of extraterritoriality. Also sanctions that are not secondary, so that are not directly targeting foreign persons. And the reason is quite simple. Primary sanctions, so the majority of US sanctions, and those part of the part of your sanction which not directly apply to non-US persons, apply anytime there is a connection with the system, anytime there is a US nexus. And US nexus is, for example, a transaction in US dollar. A transaction in US dollar, even if performed between two non-US companies outside the US. Considering the role of dollar in the international finance, considering the integrated world in which we live, and considering again, as mentioned by Professor Bitstecker, that banks often choose the path of the risk or to minimize their exposure. So they choose overcompliance. They simply avoid, cut off any transaction entailing possible sanction risk without going further in understanding if relevant sanctions derive from US sanctions, from EU sanction, or if the specific transaction could be under certain condition allowed. Considering all that, you can easily understand why, de facto, any US sanctions may have an extraterritorial effect. And the fourth, and this will be my last point, I said I am a European company, I have to abide by European law, but also have to consider US sanction. Well, US sanction and European Union sanction always diverge. And in certain cases, as I said before this evening, they could also be in conflict. I'm referring to the Iranian case. To respond to the reintroduction of these sanctions against Iran, and the blocking statute, which prohibits the companies from direct or indirect compliance with US extraterritorial sanctions against Iran. I'm not talking for my company because we do not have any particular interest in the country, in Iran. However, I'm concerned about a context, a scenario where multinational companies are placed in an impossible bind between the inconsistent demands of the two regulators. What I have to choose? On the one side, if I do business with Iran, I face US sanction enforcement, and we all know what this could mean. This could mean being excluded from any US dollar transaction in the world. On the other, if I choose to not doing business with Iran because of US sanctions, I face the possibility to be sanctioned by the European institution or to face claim in Europe by third parties. So thank you. For the moment, I'll stop here. I'm available for any demand or clarification. Thanks.
So, thank you very much also to Anais Maria Rossi from ENI. Well, now I think we put enough things on the floor. Of course, the debate about sanction is virtually endless, and we can dig it out for on many aspects. Of course, we know that 2,000 years after the Megara decree in the Peloponnesian War, that was one of the first historically recorded sanction issues. We still don't know if sanctions are the liberal alternative to war, or if they are a way to go toward a conflict in international relations. Actually, in the case of the Peloponnesian War, it was the way to the conflict. But of course, this is not the case for every sanctions nowadays. What we know that the list of sanctions that the countries that are under sanctions is growing bigger and bigger, and the sectors are more and more transversal, as it has been said. So the situation is clearly very complex, and we have, from our questions that arrived from the persons who are watching us in streaming, we have two, I think, very interesting questions that I would like to sum up and pose to you, and then you can take the floor for 3-4 minutes again, each of you, if you want, also to answer the questions and eventually to give some other comments. And then at 5:30 sharp, we have to finish our event. So the two questions is, one is about cryptocurrencies. So since many of us mentioned the issue of sanction evasion, one of our listener wants to know what cryptocurrencies, if they play a role in sanction evasion, especially in the evasion of financial sanctions, in the circumvention of sanctions. And the other one is more political. What happens in the international community if there is a country that doesn't want to comply? I mean, they accept the sanction, the legal aspect of the sanction, but they don't enforce it and they don't want to comply. So what instruments has the international community to force a country to play by the rule, that especially when it are multilateral sanctions that have been posed? What can do the international community in this case? So I think if you agree, I will follow the same order that we started, giving the floor to Professor Bierstecker for a few minutes, and then we go further with Giumelli, Moret, and Rossi.
I'm going to pass on the first question because both Francesco and Erica have been working more directly on that. So I'll comment if they say something I disagree with or want more elaboration on. To the second question, fairly direct answer. If a country doesn't want to comply, now at the UN level, what the UN has done, not very often, only on 2 occasions, but the UN has actually applied secondary sanctions on other countries. Typically, these are neighboring countries who are meddling in an existing conflict. In the first case, were the UN sanctions applied on Liberia over the Liberian government's support for the RUF forces operating in Sierra Leone. And Liberia was quite actively supporting that particular faction or that particular non-state armed group. And the UN actually applied secondary sanctions on Liberia that involved even a commodity sanction. It went beyond the usual individual sanctions, but it was short of course, comprehensive sanctions because the UN at that time was only applying new targeted measures. The second example is the sanctions that were applied on Eritrea. The Eritrean government was accused of providing arms to al-Shabaab operating in Somalia, again, neighboring country. The charge was that it was a bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So it was part of a larger, it was in the regional politics of Northeast Africa. And let me just step back a second. Francesco focused on effectiveness of measures in the work that we did, that I did with Francesco and a large group of others on the Targeted Sanctions Consortium some years ago. We do evaluations of the effectiveness of UN sanctions. And it's interesting that in both of these cases, both the secondary sanctions on Liberia and the secondary sanctions on Eritrea accomplished their objectives. They were effective. It's not very often used. It's very rarely invoked, that is a secondary sanction on a neighboring country. But when it's been used, this is a small sample N of 2, it's been effective. In both cases, we can see evidence of the effectiveness of the sanctions on Liberia and the sanctions on Eritrea. If I could I offer a comment on Maria Rossi's very interesting presentation or two? Okay, well, I have the floor, I'll do that. And just 2 comments. One, with regard to, she made a very important point about it's not just the thousands of names, and this, of course, refers to the thousands of names on the specially designated nationals lists of the US government, the SDN lists, where there are indeed thousands of individuals listed. But the additional burden for financial actors to be aware of, as she said, know your customer, know your client, to do work on the ownership or control of any of those entities or individuals. Last year, as a student of sanctions, I'm also literally sometimes a student, so I took an OFAC Essentials course. And one of the things I was taught, I was basically taking a course with other compliance officers, which just related only to US sanctions. What was very interesting is that we were taught that not only must we do research on all the potential ownership of any of our clients or customers, but we need to report that to the US government. And we must do it by a certain date every year, and OFAC compiles that information, includes it in its annual report. So part of what's been constructed is an incredibly large financial intelligence gathering operation, in a sense, where compliance officers, and I was probably one of the only US nationals taking this course. The other people taking the course were based in Shanghai, they were based in the Gulf states, they were based in India, they were based in Brazil. But in fact, the regulations are such that the financial sector itself is gathering intelligence and reporting it to, and then of course, once that information is available, additional sanctions could be applied by OFAC. Their very entities could be added to the SDN list. So it's very interesting, at least was eye-opening for me to see how much of a sort of financial surveillance or intelligence operation was underway with this. Second comment, just I want to defend the policy practitioners for a moment. You talked about the ambiguity, and I agree completely. The language is ambiguous. Sometimes it's deliberately ambiguous. Some would say that the US in particular uses ambiguity to secure overcompliance. It is actually part of the strategy of the Office of Foreign Asset Control. But to be fair, sometimes the ambiguity is simply a part of the process. And by that, I mean that if you're dealing with, particularly at either the UN or the EU level, when you're dealing at a multilateral setting in these organizations, the actual texts of the sanctions resolutions are themselves the product of compromise, bargaining, negotiation among member states. And so sometimes the ambiguity is simply papering over differences, and the lack of specificity it is in fact built into the process. So the ambiguity is there. That doesn't really solve the problem. Although there are some creative solutions. I'll point to my home here in Switzerland, where the Swiss Economics Ministry, SECO, will engage in ongoing dialogues with Swiss private sector companies about what it means to implement the Swiss implementation of UN or its own autonomous measures. It basically complies with what the EU asks for the most part. So not 100%, but mostly. And so it's a particular model for regulators to think about, because it involves not always a final answer, but an ongoing discourse with private sector firms about their obligations and responsibilities. It's relatively unique in terms of domestic level regulations, but it is a model that others might want to consider. Thanks very much for the attention.
Thank you, Professor. Francesco Giumelli, please, you as well for 3-5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much again. This is a fabulous panel and really learning a lot. So thank you again for organizing this and putting this together. Maybe I'll say a word before going over the others to the first question that I can read, and you mentioned on the cryptocurrency and yes, what we can do. Well, cryptocurrencies are nothing more or less than a way to move assets, or to allow assets to be moved. And the only problem that we have that is new, that is at the moment unregulated. And one of the ways in which we are seeing now already in many of the states, including the US, is that cryptocurrencies are now being included in the financial world, saying no matter how you move assets, if you touch cryptocurrencies or not is not an element. If you do move assets with cryptocurrency transactions, then we're going to trace you anyway. So the big problem was before that it was completely unregulated. Now, there are still very big part of the crypto or digital currencies that is unregulated. And this is the problem, but it's nothing new. I mean, if you want to move money, you go to some of the, what we call tax havens, they do exactly the same thing. And that is a problem. The problem when it comes to implementations of sanctions or tax evasion is that you lose track between individuals and assets, individuals and payments. And you don't need cryptocurrencies to hide payments. There are many other ways. So long story short, if you want to solve it, you need to regulate it and properly monitor it. Whether we want to do it, it's another story. When it comes to a couple of points I want to say on all the others. First, and this is something that we often forget, sanctions are political instruments. We get so often bogged down into discussions about trade law, public international law, public laws, and all these human rights. All these are very important discussions, but at the beginning, we need to remember that these are political instruments. And therefore, we have a big tension there, there is also a lot of unregulated, and Anais Rossi can confirm whether now in the past 10 years, we started to see in contracts a sanctions clause saying, listen, if there are sanctions, we cannot comply with the contract, so don't take us to court. That is something already changing. Arbitration is very, complicated. Again, do sanctions get there? If they do get there, what is the practice and the decisions? There is very little that we know when it comes to that side, because again, inherently sanctions are political instruments. And we need to keep thinking about this, because otherwise we think we are applying a trade instrument when in reality, this is not a trade instrument. Second point, this is something that Anna said, this is extremely important. We have outsourced not the decision of person X is a bad person. We are saying, asking the private sector, listen, make sure that whoever is going to get whatever you're selling doesn't do things that we don't want them to do. How do you know? I mean, we're asking a company to judge on the intention. So you're not regulating a product, you're regulating the intention. And the intention is very difficult to regulate. And that's also why you see a lot of ambiguities in the regulations. On the one hand, you want to keep being ambiguous because you don't know what you're regulating. So it's not, it's sometimes it's deliberate intention. You still don't know what's going to happen. So you stay, and then you want to make actors aware that something can happen. So maybe the states or the public regulators do not know, and then the private sector is aware of. Again, we're talking about the private sector that wants to comply. And that is only part of the story. If you want to ditch sanctions anyway, you don't call EFAC and ask what's the regulation. You don't even call, you don't appear in the radar. And now we keep talking about the actors who want to be on the radar. And we're creating these different worlds. On the one hand, that's also what Professor Vistego, Tom, it's hard to call you Professor Vistego. Tom was talking about this parallel world that is happening, like-minded states. There is a coordination taking place there, because that is the way to go. I mean, you need to have the cooperation. This is a political solution also to the problem of overcompliance and extraterritoriality. There are a lot of discussion now going after US companies and imposing sanctions on them from the EU, from China, imposing sanctions on the US because they're imposing these sanctions. But this is, again, another trade war. The real solution is sitting around the table and this like-minded state to have a coordinated approach to this. Because again, going back to point one, this is inherently a political discussion, nothing else. And I also want to say two final words. One thing is on the private actors, and I are completely right. They change everything. So the outcome of a sanctions policy is determined by what the private sector does. It's not that these guys are doing wrong things, and therefore if they're all behaving in the wrong way, it's because the system is designed to make them behave in the wrong way. And whatever they do, whatever they are allowed to do, is determining whether sanctions have an impact and who suffers, which is again the very important, I think, question that we should ask every time we impose a sanctions regime. Final, but this is also very important. We keep thinking, because often sanctions are imposed by the security people. And security people seem to have a difficult part in understanding that we live in a world of global value chains. You cannot think that you can easily target one part of an economy without having an effect in other parts. Look at what happened with the COVID crisis. It's supply chains everywhere. And as soon as you intervene somewhere, you're disrupting supply chains. You're not only going after many of the humanitarian impacts or effects is not an unintended consequences, but it's indeed a collateral damage, because you know that you're hitting a supply chain. And by hitting the supply chain, you hit the bad guys and the good guys, even if the good guys have no idea what's going on before they're linked in the chain or after they're linked in the chain. So that's what also makes things way more complicated. But thank you again.
Thank you very much. And the floor to Erika Moret.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo. I'll keep it brief. There's such excellent points that have already been made by both Tom and Francesco. Quick points on the cryptocurrency, just to build on what Francesco said. So, yeah, I think there's a variety of ways that that the use of cryptocurrencies could be controlled against sanctions evasion. But I should also mention that we shouldn't rule out the fact that there should also be exploration of the ways they can be used legally and for good purposes as well. So in the case of Venezuela, for example, the US government has sanctioned all cryptocurrencies, including the Petro, that was the initial attempt being developed in Caracas, and also all future cryptocurrencies that are created. So really kind of ruling out any kind of use in the Venezuelan context. And we've seen that in a number of other jurisdictions as well. I think El Salvador is an interesting case. It's the first country in the world to introduce cryptocurrencies as a legal tender, or trying to do so. The IMF has literally today or yesterday come out and said that it doesn't think this is a good idea at all. And this, of course, is not necessarily for anything to do with sanctions, but it's an interesting case study. What we also see is every central bank around the world is currently developing its own digital currencies, including the European Union. And I think that could be quite interesting in the sanctions world to see where that develops. But we have to also remember that sanctions themselves and these very prohibited environments are causing all different sectors, both legally and illegally, to try and think about crypto and other forms of technology and how that can help them continue to do their work. As I said before, including humanitarian organizations. So I think it's a bit of a vicious circle, as Francesco alluded to as well. We have to remember as well that in the US review on sanctions, on its page 2, it actually highlights alternative remittance routes as one of the key ongoing concerns. So once again, I see a great contradiction in that. I think I'll finish there. I think building on Anais Maria's point as well, which was a really good one, is when even if we manage to solve some of these problems of overcompliance, how do you then persuade companies to go back into countries like we saw with Iran? Even when the sanctions were lifted, Total and a whole host of other countries still weren't willing to go back and do business in Iran. And this was a cause of great tension between Tehran and the other negotiating parties. So I think it's one we have to keep in mind with other sanction jurisdictions around the world as well. But I'll finish there and pass it on to Anais Maria to make her comments as well.
Yes, thank you. I'll make a very, very brief comment. I saw the 2 questions on Iran and blocking statutes. I just want to mention to you that the European Union is aware that the blocking statute is proven ineffective. And they recently launched a public consultation on possible, asking for comments on possible review of the blocking statute. So we all hope that such revision will lead to new mechanism, to new form of support that will be actually able to shield the new operators from the politicization of international trade.
So thanks a lot. I think there are other questions, but they have been touched by our speakers. Just let me say one more thing, and then I think I can give the floor for the conclusions. Because there was in the chat one question about, it's very, very interesting. If sanctions will prove to be effective, this is the question, would they somehow replace a war as an instrument of international relations? This is very, very tricky question, and cannot answer. Just I suggested to have a look to this book of some 10 years ago from Juan Zarate, The Era of Financial Warfare, where he's talking about a new way of fighting using the financial tools. But what can I comment on this is that sanction cannot replace the other instruments that are diplomacy and the use of force. They are just something in between. So they just enlarged the arch of the use of force, the arch of the possibility, but still they remain complete. They go from diplomacy, and sanctions are part of the diplomacy as well, until conflict. And sanctions are a way of having a conflict. So it's a sort of hybrid status between diplomacy, politics, and conflict, kinetic conflict. And there was a joke some years ago in the United States that sanctions are something in between. When there is a crisis, you have an option. or you send Jimmy Carter as a negotiator, or you send in the Marines. So some sanctions are something in between these two extremes. And I think there is a sort of a little truth in this joke. But now I give the floor for the conclusion to, I think we have Dr. Botti for the conclusion of this seminar, right?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you very much also for moderating the event in such a brilliant and an effective way. But just a few words, let me express the appreciation of the Istituto Affari Internazionali for your extremely valuable contribution by all the speakers to this event. The panel with all the intervention and following interactions provided multiple perspective on the issue of international sanction, both in the state of practices and current contemporary challenges related to them, and many elements and inputs. You probably can see them from my note, from my reaction during the seminar, to sketch possible developments of the international sanction system in such an increasingly unstable global order. Professor Biersteker reviewed the origins and evolution of the UN sanction regimes, and not only, and especially focusing on the rise of different types of financial sanctions. And also describing, that was also very interesting, how financial sanctions are complementary with other restrictive measures, and that's made very difficult to identify the direct effect. Was also mentioned by Paolo, how was important to highlight the nexus between unilateralism and extraterritoriality. Francesco Giumelli focused on, as was introduced by Paolo, sanctions effectiveness, implementation, and evasion. One question was really interesting: what we mean about sanction effectiveness? Do we want to send signals, or are we expecting a future behavior rather than an actual current behavior? Are they useful, or I mean convenient? You propose a sort of, let me say, cost-benefit analysis in assessing that. And then another important point, the difference between effectiveness and impact relating to the relevance of implementation. And then Erika Moret explored the humanitarian impact in a increasingly complex compliance environment, and the rise in financial sector de-risking associated with extraterritorial sanctions, with a very interesting example on Syria and Afghanistan that are related to your recent research, if I'm not wrong. Mariana Isrossi explained what does it mean to do business in a world of sanctions, and more specifically how a multinational company has any deal with sanctions compliance risk. And I think it was really interesting and extremely valuable to have a contribution from the business sector after your the introduction, the first intervention of experts and analysts. I think we are approaching the end of this webinar. Let me also thank all the participants to this event in the audience for their attention, for their also active interaction through the Q&A chat. Unfortunately, we couldn't include all the questions we got coming from the chat, given the time constraint. I also thanks the Intesa Sanpaolo, that is partner of this event organized by Istituto Affari Internazionali. I hope all of you enjoyed this event. Thanks for your attention. We can close the webinar here. I hope you have a a pleasant day.